Today we are looking at the philosophy of Buddhism. The man we call Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama. The word Buddha means enlightened one. This was not his name at birth. He was born in an area near Nepal, near India, and came from a Hindu background. His family were aristocrats. Think of them like nobility. They had a lot of wealth and privilege. This was the world Siddhartha was born into. As a young man, Buddha wanted to figure out how to solve the problem of suffering, and spent a night meditating under a bo tree. During the course of the night, he faced worldly temptations. There were demons who wanted him to leave behind his idealism and just be part of the world. All the pleasures of the world were brought before him, but he ignored them and kept working on the problem of suffering. He eventually made it through the night with the answers he had been seeking. This new way of seeing the world became known as Buddhism. He spent the rest of his life teaching others these ideas. Buddhist philosophy starts with what's known as the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is that suffering is a part of life. There's nothing you can do about it. You will get sick, you will get old, and you will die. Further, people you love will die, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. But what you can do is reduce your suffering by realizing what causes suffering. The second noble truth is that suffering is caused by desire. It is because you desire to be healthy that sickness makes you suffer. It is because you desire your friends and family to stay alive that their deaths cause you to suffer. The answer is clear. To avoid suffering, you must reduce desire. The less you desire something, the less you will suffer if you don't get it. If you are not caught up in the things that can happen to you, you will not be upset if things go wrong. The fourth noble truth is that in order to reduce desire and therefore reduce suffering, one must follow the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is a set of behaviors that are to be followed to maintain an enlightened state of being. These are having right views, right intent, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The idea here is that if you maintain self-control in all of these areas, you will stay on the path of goodness. Another key Buddhist claim is the idea that everything is impermanent. Part of the problem of suffering and desire is that it is natural to think that things will last forever and to become attached to things in the world. Buddha wants us to break this thought pattern and understand first off that nothing lasts forever, and then to achieve enlightenment, one cannot become too attached to anything that exists. For Buddha, true enlightenment is found in detachment from the world and freedom from desire. Here we have a concept unique in Buddhist thought, the claim that the self is an illusion. In contrast to the Hindu belief system of his time, Buddha claimed that we cannot know for sure that there is an immortal soul, so we should operate under the assumption that just like everything else that exists, we too are impermanent beings. Further, the existence of a self or an identity that exists over and above our bodies is an illusion. The claim here is that each of us are a collection of experiences and physical manifestations, but we should not convince ourselves that we have a metaphysical identity that is the self that persists through time. In the same way that we should not be attached to things in the world, we should also not be attached to what we think is our identity, because that itself is not only impermanent, but is also an illusion. The picture that emerges here is that to reach enlightenment or nirvana, one must not get too attached to things in the world. The Sanskrit word for things in the world is Mara. The sooner we are able to realize that the self is an illusion and everything is impermanent, the closer we will get to an enlightened state of being. Let's look at the picture that emerges. Mara are those things in the world that distract us from our ideal state. This includes physical pleasure, but it also includes emotions like anger, grief, jealousy, and heartache. All of these ways of being are a result of being too attached to things in the world. To be enlightened, one must have a mental block between yourself and the outside world. To become detached from these things in the world is to take a huge step on the path towards enlightenment. The Sanskrit word for enlightenment here being nirvana. Let's take a look at the text and see how these ideas were articulated. The text we are looking at is called the Dhammapada. These are sayings from the Buddha himself. The translation we are looking at was completed by Juan Mascaro. To recap, Juan Mascaro is the translator, Buddha himself is the author. What we are comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows him as the wheel of the cart follows the beast that draws the cart. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with a pure mind, joy follows him as his own shadow. This makes me think of people in today's day and age. We are constantly looking for stimulation. We are constantly checking our phones or going here or there for a meal or a drink. We barely have time to sit still and appreciate what we have. This constant seeking of pleasure is ultimately unfulfilling and empty. Not only does it fail to give us a sense of meaning or purpose, it also always leaves us unsatisfied and looking for more. The answer Buddha gives us is to stop wanting things all the time and just to be content with things as they are. Think of someone walking through the mall and being constantly pulled in the direction of their desires. Oh, look at that new fashion. Hey, check this gadget out. I smell pretzels. I want one. This person is like a weak tree being shaken by the wind. They have no core self. They are just being pulled around by things of the world. This makes me think of people in today's day and age. We are constantly looking for stimulation. We are constantly checking our phones or going here or there for a meal or a drink. We barely have time to sit still and appreciate what we have. This constant seeking of pleasure is ultimately unfulfilling and empty. Not only does it fail to give us a sense of meaning or purpose, it also always leaves us unsatisfied and looking for more. The answer Buddha gives us is to stop wanting things all the time and just to be content with things as they are. Think of someone walking through the mall and being constantly pulled in the direction of their desires. Oh, look at that new fashion. Hey, check this gadget out. I smell pretzels. I want one. This person is like a weak tree being shaken by the wind. They have no core self. They are just being pulled around by things of the world. Even as rain breaks through an ill-thatched house, passions will break through an ill-guarded mind. But even as rain breaks not through a well-thatched house, passions break not through a well-guarded mind. The world is constantly presenting us with desirable things. If we want to be free from suffering, we must train ourselves to reduce our desires, no matter how much the world wants us to want things. I imagine that some of you right now might be thinking about what you're going to have to eat later, or what you will do with your free time next weekend. But what happens when you get what you want? Will you be happy then? or will you just be thinking about the next thing that you want from the world? Again, for Buddha, if we want to reduce suffering, we must reduce desire. Whereas if a man speaks but a few holy words, and yet he lives the life of those words, free from passion and hate and illusion, with right vision and a mind free, craving for nothing, both now and hereafter, the life of this man is a life of holiness. Never surrender to carelessness, never sink into weak pleasures and lust. Those who are watchful in deep contemplation reach in the end the joy supreme. The monk who has the joy of watchfulness and who looks with fear on thoughtlessness, he can never be deprived of his victory, and he is near nirvana. Remember, for Buddha, not only is the world out there a set of things that distract us from an enlightened state of being, but our idea of ourselves is also part of this illusion. Even what we think of as the self is an illusion, and to become wrapped up in our own emotions and reactions is to be wrapped up in an illusion. Okay, let's take a moment and think through some arguments against Buddhism. The first is the idea that life goals are themselves a form of desire, and it is life goals that give life meaning and purpose. So if Buddha wants us to reduce our desires, this means we will have no goals. So Buddhism will take away the meaning and purpose of life. Another counterargument is that desiring to reduce desire is itself a desire. If one is always desiring to reduce desire, one can never truly be free from desire. My response here is to think about the graph on the screen. This is a visual representation of the idea that there is a direct relationship between desire and suffering. The more desires one has, the more one is open to the possibility of suffering. This is a key Buddhist insight that makes a lot of sense. In this regard, I would offer a few thoughts in response to these counter-arguments. 1. In regards to the idea that a life without desire has no purpose, I would say that while we may not all want to get to the point of zero desire and zero suffering, we can at least see the insight that keeping our desires in check is a good way to keep our potential suffering in check. Rather than thinking there is nothing wrong with having plenty of desires and attachments, we could see the insight that reducing the number and intensity of our desires and attachments might be good for our mental well-being. The other thought is in regards to the apparent contradiction of seeking to solve the problem of suffering and desire by desiring to reduce desire. Here again, I would say that the goal might not be to get to the 0 point of absolute nirvana, but to take steps to keep our desires and suffering in check. The other point in regards to someone who is aspiring to become a truly enlightened Buddhist, I would say that nirvana is not an all or nothing proposition. It is a state of mind that becomes a baseline of being, rather than a state that is reached like crossing a finish line. One can pass in and out of pure detachment. Further, with practice, one can eventually stop thinking about reducing desire and just be. Here we have a powerful mental image from the text about how desires are a trap of our own making. Those who are slaves of desires run into the stream of desires, even as a spider runs into the web that it made. Therefore, some men cut their fetters and start to walk on the path, leaving sorrows behind. The idea here is that we are the ones who create our own downfall. We want things so much that we end up caught up in our own web of desires. If we stopped desiring things so much, we'd be free to just exist. Okay, let's say a few words about the Eightfold Path. This is a collection of behaviors that we should keep in mind if we want to reach nirvana. Buddha wants us to have the right views, the right intent, the right speech, the right conduct, the right livelihood, the right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. What does all of this mean? First off, we should be connecting all of our thoughts and actions to the principles of reducing desire and attachment and reducing suffering. We should keep our minds in check. We should also keep our behavior in check. Further, we should not live a life that is built around desire and attachment. I will also say that Buddhism is not just about the individual path towards enlightenment. One must also do what one can to reduce the suffering of others. Let's look at some texts that reflect these ideas. The mind is fickle and flighty. It flies after fancies wherever it likes. It is indeed difficult to restrain, but it is a great good to control the mind. A mind self-controlled is a source of great joy. Studies have shown that Buddhist monks have what one might call a more relaxed brain state. Rather than being caught up with desires, the focused mind is better able to concentrate and is more calm and free from stress. Forsake anger, give up pride. Sorrow cannot touch the man who is not in the bondage of anything, who owns nothing. Here we have a reflection of many of the principles of the Eightfold Path. Let's talk for a minute about anger. Where does anger come from? It comes from frustrated desire. You want people to treat you a certain way. You want life to turn out a certain way. When things don't go the way you wanted, you get angry. The Buddhist answer would be, stop wanting the world to be a certain way, and then you won't get upset. Next we have, all beings tremble before danger. All fear death. When a man considers this, he does not kill or cause to kill. And then we have, how can there be laughter? How can there be pleasure when the whole world is burning? When you are in deep darkness, will you not ask for a lamp? The message here is that Buddha wants us to be compassionate towards the suffering of others. We should do what we can to reduce our own suffering, but also we should certainly not inflict suffering on other beings. Buddha envisions a world free from suffering, and it was his belief that following these principles would get us there. Never surrender to carelessness, never sink into weak pleasures and lust. Those who are watchful in deep contemplation reach in the end joy supreme. Okay, let's talk about another aspect of Buddhism, the belief in impermanence. Buddhists insist that nothing in the world lasts forever. As such, we should accept this fact and move forward. We should not be too attached to things or people because everything will ultimately be destroyed or die. Here is some text that reflects this idea. He who knows that this body is the foam of a wave, the shadow of a mirage, he breaks the sharp arrows of Mara, concealed in the flowers of sensuous passions, and unseen by the king of death, he goes on and follows his path. This is connected to another idea we have noted regarding Buddhist metaphysics. Classical Buddhism rejects the idea that we have an immortal soul. This runs counter to the Hindu belief that the soul lives on after the body dies. For Buddhists, the mind is part of the body and not some separate and distinct metaphysical entity. Again, as with all religions and philosophies, there are some Buddhists who believe in the existence of the immortal soul, but according to the original teachings, The idea of the immortal soul is rejected. Here is some text that reflects this idea. Consider this body, a painted puppet with jointed limbs, sometimes suffering and covered with ulcers, full of imaginings, never permanent, forever changing. According to Buddhism, you are not the same person you were 5 years ago. Does this idea sound correct to you? Okay, what are the outcomes of this belief? If I do not really exist, then I should not have desires. It doesn't make sense to desire something for something that's not really real. If I do not really exist, then I am no more important than anyone else. We are all part of the same existence. No one is particularly special. You are just as important as anyone else. You should treat yourself as well as you treat others. As a result, Buddhists practice compassion towards all living things. All right, now that we have covered the philosophy of Buddhism, let's talk about a few ways we can train ourselves to put these ideas into practice. Here is one way that Buddhists train themselves to deal with impermanence. They create these beautiful works of art known as mandalas. They take colored sand and spend hours making an image. When they are done, they pray, they chant, they light incense, and then they spray glue on it and hang it in a museum? No. They brush it away and watch it disappear. This exercises their ability to deal with impermanence. It seems a little silly to us here in the West, where we always are wanting to preserve our cultural artifacts, but this is how we can come to accept impermanence for the truth that it is. There is an interesting school of thought that emerged in Japan called Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism focuses on exercises to reduce desires and focus the mind. Zen Buddhism is an outgrowth of this one time where Buddha was set to give a lecture to his followers. He stood up before the gathered individuals and said nothing. All he did was twirl a lotus flower in his fingers. Everyone gave him a puzzled look, not sure where he was going with this. One person had a look of understanding on his face, and Buddha said something like, "This guy gets it. That is all for today," and left. From this one event, a school of thought emerged which sought to practice this art of pursuing enlightenment through pure being. Zen Buddhists seek those moments of no mind, where the mind is free from all stress and just exists. One way to practice Zen Buddhism is to use mental puzzles to clear your mind. Ask yourself, what was the appearance of your face before your ancestors were born? You think about this for a moment and your eyes go cross-eyed and you forget about all the things you were stressed out about. Another one is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Again, these questions have no rational answer. When you think about these questions, you are free from desire, you are free from stress, you are one step closer toward the feeling of enlightenment. It is admittedly a little silly, but that's kind of the point. If you can let yourself be free to be silly sometimes, it will help you from getting caught up with desires, suffering, stress, and anger. You'll be free from these sorts of things and be better able to just exist. Another famous Zen question is, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it still make a sound? You are meant to have a moment of confusion, freeing yourself from everyday worries and stresses. One book which documents some tales from Zen Buddhism is Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. This book was written centuries after Buddha lived and is meant as a guide for those Buddhists seeking nirvana through mindfulness. Here are a few stories from that book. A cup of tea. Nan-in, a Japanese master during the Meiji era, received a university professor who came in to inquire about Zen. Nan-in served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the overflow until he could no longer restrain himself. It is overfull. No more can go in. Like this cup, Nanan said, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? The idea here is that it is important to have an open mind. You should never think that you know everything about a subject. There is always more to learn. There are always more perspectives to think about. If you are not open to new ideas, you will never grow. Here's one called temper. A Zen student came to Banki and complained, "Master, I have an ungovernable temper. How can I cure it?" "You have something very strange," replied Banki. "Let me see what you have." "Just now I cannot show it to you," replied the other. "Well, when can you show it to me?" asked Banki. "It arises unexpectedly," replied the student. "Then," concluded Banki, "it must not be your own true nature. If it were, you could show it to me at any time. When you were born, you did not have it, and your parents did not give it to you. Think that over." The idea here being that anger is something created by ourselves. We make ourselves who we are by the way that we think. If we trained ourselves to have better thought processes, we could avoid things like outbursts of anger. Okay, we'll do one more. And before we conclude, let me just say that I look forward to your responses to these ideas in our class discussion. I hope these ideas give you a new perspective and something to think over. Thank you for your attention and participation. This one is a letter to a dying man. Basui wrote the following letter to one of his disciples who was about to die. The essence of your mind is not born, so it will never die. It is not an existence which is perishable. It is not an emptiness which is a mere void. It has neither color nor form. It enjoys no pleasures and suffers no pains. I know you are very ill. Like a good Zen student, you are facing sickness squarely. You may not know exactly who is suffering, but question yourself, what is the essence of the mind? Think only of this. You will need no more. Covet nothing. Your end, which is endless, is as a snowflake dissolving in pure air.